Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on accessing capital funding for your project. We have a large number of people booked, so I'll just wait a couple more seconds to make sure everyone's let in. My name is Tamara. I work for Locality, and I'll be presenting today with my colleagues Josie Baker and Debbie Lamb. So today we're focusing on helping you raise funds for your capital project. And we'll start off by exploring what's important to have in place before you actually start your fundraising, and how understanding your skills and capacity can prepare you better for successful capital fundraising. We'll then move on to scoping out capital funding requirements and how to find and apply to grant funders. We'll also cover other kinds of fundraising you can do for your project. We'll then welcome Karen Dobson from Scotswood Natural Community Garden, and she'll talk about her successful campaign to raise substantial amounts of money from a diverse range of different capital funders and the challenges that came with that. We will cover social investment, including when it's a good option and what funders want to see, as well as community shares. And we'll finalize by focusing a bit on the importance of record keeping for an informed board and other stakeholders. We'll have time at the end, hopefully plenty of time to answer as many questions as possible. Throughout the webinar, you're welcome to already write your questions, but please use the Q&A box and not the chat function. If you use a chat function, that might interfere with people who are watching the webinar via the live stream. So again, please use the Q&A box for this. So this webinar is a legacy of the Community Ownership Fund Support Program, where 10 organizations and infrastructure groups from 4 nations that are listed there on the, presented there, sorry, on the slide, provided advice and guidance to organizations applying for the Community Ownership Fund. And now that the fund is actually closed, we want to share our learning and resources developed as part of the support program over the last few years. So we are Locality. Locality is a national charity. We believe in supporting organizations to make them strong and successful. And we do that by providing direct support and advice to organizations. We develop a range of tools and resources and webinars like these. We are a membership. We have a very large membership network. There are over 2,000 organizations today that are members of Locality from across England. And it's a great way to learn from each other, stay connected, and get relevant information. We also do quite a fair bit of lobbying with government and try and influence government to create a better operating environment for community organizations like yourselves. Apologies. We also have a consultancy arm. You can actually commission us to come in and work with your organization. And we cover a number of different areas, including governance, business planning, funding, community asset ownership, community engagement, impact measurement, marketing, and much more. You can find out more about that on our website. We always encourage people to join the Locality Network if you're not a member yet. There are 3 tiers of membership. The first one is free, and we really encourage you to join that one. It's a great way to stay connected and learn from each other, get advice, have access to training, tools, and resources, be the first to find out about new programs or funding opportunity, and even have your input in national campaigns or other campaigns that we may be leading on for the sector. So we'll mention my community more than once today. It's a website and it's a free resource that's managed by Locality. There's an incredible array of information on there on all aspects of running an organization. For examples relevant to you are resources around community asset ownership, lots of videos and webinars and a number of these topics. There's an excellent resource on assessing the feasibility of a community asset project. There's clear guidance on how to prepare capital grant applications. There's also another fantastic resource on writing a business plan specific for a capital project, including templates for a cash flow forecast and risk register. There's a social investment hub and lots of case studies. So I really encourage you to go to my community and access these free resources. This is a screenshot of what it looks like. On top of that is a capital funding directory. Josie will cover this in a little bit more detail and actually show you how it works and how you can research for relevant sources of funding. This is a resource, again, that came out of the support program. It's been up and running for almost a year and has almost, I think, just over 100 different sources of finance and funding for capital projects. So again, a great resource we'll encourage you to use for your fundraising research. So what should you have in place before you start fundraising? It's important that you make sure that you are ready for this journey, for want of a better word, because capital fundraising is a significant undertaking for a charity and other not-for-profit organizations. So being well prepared is crucial for success. For that, you want to make sure you have a solid foundation, both for your organization as well as for your project plans. So funders really understand the higher risk of capital projects, and therefore so should you. And funders will pay closer attention to you as an organization than maybe other funders would, because they understand these risks. A good starting point, therefore, would be to create a case for support, or a really compelling one, which outlines not only the details on your project and why you need the funding and what you want to actually do, but importantly, the problem it addresses and the clear and measurable impact it will have on your beneficiaries and the community. So focus on the end game and not just the details of your project. It should be inspiring, well-researched, and data-backed. So this can be a shorter document in the beginning, but the content that we already be developing will be useful initially to get internal buy-in or external buy-in presented to your board, for example, but then can start generating the content for your actual funding applications or your business plan. As you start writing things down and as you start completing funding applications or writing your business plan, a top tip is to always keep in mind what is it that a funder will like to see and what assurances do they need. Keep in mind that most of the larger funders you might be applying for are national organizations, and so assume they know nothing about you and nothing about your local area. So don't be shy to state the obvious. So making your case. Are you genuinely clear about the reasons this project is important and vital? You need to show that you understand your area and community well by detailing how you've actually identified this need. And in order to do that, consultation is really important. And consultation is effectively when you go out to your community and beyond in terms of stakeholders and ask them what is it they actually need and what their input is into your project. It allows you to test your idea, so it's important feedback for yourself, to get invaluable feedback from the community that you're saying you want to serve, and you can show funders that you have incorporated this input. It really is the most powerful way to get buy-in and support from your community and key stakeholders, and to galvanize excitement and support for your project. It's important that you plan for a consultation that is wide and varied, understanding that different age groups, different sections of your communities prefer different kinds of platforms and mechanisms to engage with your consultation, in person, online, door-to-door knocking. So really think carefully about what your consultation strategy will be. And it's also a really great opportunity to try and engage different parts of your community that you may have struggled to bring into your organization and benefit from your services. Consultation can also happen in 2 stages, depending on the complexity of your project. It might be first to get feedback on a concept or general idea, and subsequently for input into more detailed plans. Now, how to make your case even stronger. So it may seem obvious to you why your project will bring benefits locally. You've had a long track record, you're very well known, but again, assume nothing, Avoid the pitfall of not presenting these benefits really clearly. And strong messaging is a really impactful way of doing that. So here's an example of how an organization might describe their plans to enhance the community hub and what we think would be a better way of presenting it. Our new enhanced community hub will offer additional room for new activities and services in our area. The new layout will enable us to offer a range of mental health related activities, increase our ability to generate income through rent charges, and bring in many more people to our centre. Alternatively, this is what could be written. A high proportion of members of our community suffers from social isolation, poor health indicators, and high levels of mental health challenges. A new enhanced community hub will enable us to develop a more expansive and bespoke program of mental health activities that will offer something impactful to all ages and sections of our community. Building on our strong partnerships with local charities, GP practices, and the local authority, the new hub will have a significant positive impact on our most vulnerable by supporting more connected and active lives. So it's not a bad idea to refer back to your mission or vision or your key objectives, or it may also be a good time to actually revisit these, because your purpose for your organization itself should be clear, it should be impactful, it should be exciting and inspiring, it should really captivate the imagination of people. But don't forget, funders are effectively humans who work for the funder, right? And the purpose of your capital project should align to the purposes of your organization and highlight clearly how it will help you deliver your stated objectives. The benefits may also include other things like accessibility, environmental impact, and cost savings, so consider these carefully as well. And as you make your case for your plans, can you show that you've actually considered all the alternatives? Is this big capital project, or potentially a smaller one, really the best solution for the area? And so the more that you show you know your area, that you've really considered that actually a partnership with another space is just not feasible, or there's nothing like it in the local area, the more it will strengthen your demand from funders for money for your capital project. So I want to talk a little bit about understanding the skills and capacity required to access capital funding. You really want to show strong governance and management capacity. Funders will assess you on this. If you feel that this is something that needs further attention, then do so before you start applying for capital funding. If you don't have a track record in raising funds for some kind of capital project, showing a well-developed delivery process and plan will not only help you, but will give funders assurances that they want. This may be something new to your organization that you've never done before, so carefully consider your current staff, board, and volunteers, and what their skill set and experience actually is, and if they are appropriate for this project. Consider the time required not only to fundraise and manage the build, but also to successfully run the new and expanded asset. So your capital project doesn't end, but when the works are completed, it will last for a few years. Also think about the value of your board. I mean, there's nothing more valuable than a retired quantity surveyor or someone with building experience or a project manager to sit on your board. So if you don't have that skill set, now might be the good time to recruit a new board member or two. Other key things that you want to consider that's important for you to have in place. If you haven't done maybe capital funding before, you may not have a procurement policy, which effectively outlines your rules when you source out suppliers to do building works and other things. So it is important to have one, and funders will want to see it. Although keep in mind that some funders may actually have their own procurement criteria that you'll need to follow, but having your own is definitely a requirement and a good starting point. Carefully consider ultimately who will be responsible for the financial management of the funds and the project, who will likely be the ones potentially reporting to the funders on a regular basis. You want to ensure that your systems are equipped to deal with the risk of larger funds or greater complexity of a capital project. And you may want to set up a working group potentially to focus just on the capital project. And this can include relevant staff, board members, and potentially even a trusted external stakeholder, someone who's a true friend and is well connected. So you've cut the ribbon, now what? And that's a position that you don't want to find yourselves in. From the outset, you really need to consider the longevity of your project. Be realistic about the demand for your space, especially if you plan to generate new income. Don't make assumptions that just because you might have a different layout or greater space or a new space, that will be filled up. Use your existing partners and explore potential new ones to gauge this demand. And a business plan, including long-term financial projections, 3 to 5 years, is really a vital tool to enable you to do this. Another thing to really keep in mind is that the process could take longer and be more onerous than you plan for. This is generally the case. Quotes that you will get in 9 months' time, in a year's time, or sorry, a year after that, will likely be obsolete. So give yourselves plenty of room for contingencies, both financial and your timeframes. Health of reserves is also really good practice and provides you flexibility to deal with the unexpected. If you're dealing with 2 different funders and you're in the middle of a build or some kind of installation and there's a delay receiving funds from a funder, you can't just necessarily stop your works, and having reserves is something you can tap into quite easily. Thank you. I'll pass over to Josie now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. So now I'm going to move on to talk about scoping out capital funding requirements. So what do we mean by scoping out capital funding requirements? Now, when we talk about this, we talk about, in short, understanding how much funding you need and what you need that funding for. And it's really important that you do this work at the outset, because this will really paint a picture of the work required. And there will likely be unexpected costs, but this will allow you to manage the risks where you can from the beginning. So things to consider, things like up-to-date valuations if you're purchasing an asset. A full condition survey, so this should tell you what works need to take place now, soon, and later with indicative costs, so you can get a picture of the overall work required to renovate an asset. Other surveys, so things like hazardous materials surveys, ecological surveys, flooding risk assessments. You should seek professional advice from an architect or quantity surveyor on what surveys you need for your specific property. You might not necessarily understand by looking at it what kind of issues you might come across. An energy audit is really important. It's important from the perspective of evidencing that you've considered this to a capital funder, for cost savings for you, and for reducing your carbon footprint as an organisation and understanding what you need to do. And an access audit will consider things like how accessible is your building on the whole, and look at things like doorways, ramps and corridors, and make sure that it's fit for the whole community. So once you understand the full condition of your asset, then you can explore what the required and ideal works will cost. So thinking about, can the works be phased? So perhaps you have necessary repairs, but then you also have additional desired works to improve community use of the space. They could potentially be separated. It's really important that you seek expertise, both for the success of your project and because this is something that capital funders will want to see. So an architect will be able to advise and draw up plans, for example, for renovation or extension works. A quantity surveyor will be able to cost up these plans developed by an architect, or cost up refurbishment works where an architect is not required. And both will be able to advise on phasing. So if you've got a complex project, for example, drawn up by an architect, we would advise that you don't try and split that up yourself, but you seek professional advice on how that might be divided to make sure that it's done in a way that makes sense for the building or asset. And for basic or lower cost renovation work, so this might be things like windows or door replacements, you may not need architect plans, but simply quotes from contractors. And generally, we would say that 3 quotes is good practice, but as Tamara said, it's always worth checking the procurement guidelines of specific funders to make sure that you fall in within that. So it's really important now to stop, reflect and ask yourself, what is the overall cost of your project? And if you can phase the project, how much would each phase cost? And it's really important to sort of understand this before you start seeking capital funding, because it will allow you to sort of view the project in its entirety and create a clear plan of action. Next, it's important to think about how long your project will take. And it's helpful to understand this before you start seeking capital funding, because capital funders will want to know the timescales of your project, but also understanding the timescales will allow you both to know which capital funders to apply for based on assessment timescales and set yourself time-bound targets for securing capital funding. So a quantity surveyor should be able to draw up a Gantt chart, a bit like the picture on the right-hand side, which will give key milestones for a successful project. And it's really important to consider other things that might impact timescales. So things like, for example, weather. So if you're doing a roof replacement, this might take longer in the winter months than the summer, for example, because it will be likely disturbed by weather. And contingency is important when we're thinking about time as well as finances. Things often take longer than expected, so make sure that you're building in contingency. And then ask yourself, how much time are you going to allocate to sourcing capital funding? And this will really depend on what works you're carrying out, but also what your capacity is as a leader of an organisation, but also as an organisation as a whole. And make sure that you're being realistic about this. We find that organisations often struggle to fund these project development costs. So things like architects' fees, quantity surveyor fees, full condition surveys, which are required by organisations before applying to capital funding. And we totally appreciate that this is difficult. This is something that you can use your reserves for. It's also something that you could use any unrestricted funding stream for. But we've also pulled together this resource that provides some guidance, tips and sources of project development funding. So once we share these slides after the session, you can go to this link and have a little look and think about how you might fund these costs. I'm now going to talk about finding and applying to grant funders. That's probably why a lot of you are here, to understand what funding is available and what funding you can apply for. So we'll talk a little bit about this. Finding suitable capital grant funders. So here are some examples of places that you can look, and this is not exhaustive. I'm sure there are lots of other places that you can think of where you can look to find capital funding, but here's some initial tips. So things like your local voluntary community and social enterprise sector infrastructure organisation. They may have sort of a mail sign up where you can receive regular emails to understand about funding available in your local area. Your local authority. National government, so for funding streams, for example, from the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, or the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, which we know that the Community Ownership Fund came from. UK community foundations to help you find local community foundations in your area. Grantscape is helpful. They administer community funds on behalf of local authorities and large-scale renewable energy developers. There are an array of online grant funders, some with paywalls and some that are free. One example of this is Grants Online, and it's good to do a general search. There's lots of filter criteria that you can apply to search for funding for your specific needs. Membership organisations such as Locality. So for example, if you register as a network member with us, you'll receive regular email communications, and this includes information about new funding streams. And similarly, all of the partner organisations on the slides that Tamara spoke about will have insight on funding within their own area or place of expertise. So we'd really recommend that you check these out. The Heritage Funding Directory is really useful if you're undertaking a heritage project. That doesn't always mean that your building has to be a listed building. Some heritage funders will fund projects that have other elements of heritage, maybe in the way that you're delivering activities, for example. A Google search is generally helpful, particularly if you're delivering a very specific activity. You might stumble across other capital funders that way. The My Community Capital Funding Directory, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And if you know of any projects that have done similar things, have a look at their annual accounts and see what capital funding they have secured. So this is the My Community Capital Funding Directory, and this has been developed to support you to find capital funding. Now, it's not supposed to be completely exhaustive. It provides some examples of significant funders to get you started. And this will be updated shortly on the My Community website, specifically with additional funders in Wales. And this resource provides information on national funders. So some cover the whole of the UK, while others cover just England or England plus another country or countries. Significant regional funders in England, and funders in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And it allows you to filter by funding type. So grant, loan, blended finance, equity, and crowdfunding. And it gives an explanation of some of these funding types on this cover tab that you can see here. And this is a picture of the National Funders tab, just to give you a little bit of an example of what this looks like when you go onto it. So in columns B and C, you can see that there's little arrows where you can essentially filter by funding type, but also by area covered. It states the minimum and maximum amount that you can apply for. This is really important to pay attention to, particularly if you've got a huge amount of capital funding to raise to sort of decide on your strategy moving forward. And it gives you links to access more information and assess your specific eligibility. So I'm going to talk a bit about directing your efforts to ensure suitability and eligibility. We would really recommend that you do the legwork here now to prevent you from putting time and effort into an application where you are not eligible or it's unsuitable for your needs. For example, if the timescales are too long. So here are some things that you might want to consider. So like I mentioned when we looked at the capital funding directory, the maximum amount of funding available and whether this is suitable when you consider all of the capital funders that you want to apply to. Match funding requirements. So some capital funders will want you to have match funding secured before you apply. Some will want some match funding sort of provisionally secured. Some will be happy to be the first funder in a mix. So it's worth considering that and thinking about when you're applying. Different funders might require specific size or turnover of organisations to access specific amounts of funding. So it's worth looking at the details of kind of the FAQs and eligibility requirements on a specific funder's website. Activity areas and themes that are funded. So think about, do you fit this well? Or as we sort of put here, would you be squeezing a square peg into a round hole? Now, generally, where you feel like, where you read a sort of capital funders areas and themes and you feel like you're a really good fit, that's where you're most likely to be successful rather than trying to make something fit. Thinking about eligible legal structures. So for example, if you are a non-for-profit company limited by guarantee without charitable status, that might limit the types of capital funders that you can apply to. So worth bearing that in mind. Think about eligible costs. So some capital funders, for example, might not fund things like equipment and fit out. Application deadlines, both for expression of interest and full application stages, so that you can understand your time and capacity against these. Assessment timeframes. Some funders can take 6 months, 9 months, even a year to process large capital applications. So it's important to recognise this from the outset. And the work required for the application. So some funders will want to see all of the information in a very specific format. Others will allow you to upload your business plan, for example, and might have a few supporting questions. So really understanding how much time is it going to take me to complete this application. And this is another question really for you to reflect on. How can you be strategic as an organisation to maximise your application output with your available resources? And this will be individual to each organisation. So you may, for example, choose to put lots of time and energy into a couple of very well-suited applications. Or you might find, for example, that several funders want information presented in a very similar way. So you could submit multiple applications with limited additional time required. The important thing here really is that you have a plan. And of course, your plan can change, but having one really allows you to structure your time from the outset. Here are some tips on applying to grant funders. So we'd recommend that you map out your target funders, deadlines and application requirements at the outset and identify where there's overlap, but also particular pinch points where you may need to bring in additional support or capacity. The expression of interest stage is a really great opportunity to engage with funders. Often there's an opportunity at this point to actually speak to the funder, and if you have that opportunity, we'd really recommend that because you might get additional tips on applying to them. It sounds self-explanatory, but we'd highly recommend that you build your application in a Word document with autosave mode so that you can upload it when it's complete. Many funders don't allow you to save your application as you go on their website, so you could end up putting a lot of time and energy into an application that ultimately gets lost, which of course none of us want. Aim to finish your application well before the deadline, and this allows space and time to make sure that you're checking for things like spelling and grammar, but also getting somebody else to review it, especially when you've spent a lot of time in a document. There might be things that you miss. Many funders will have a maximum file size of uploads, so make sure that you check this against the file size of your uploads and make sure that you can upload the documents that you want to. And aim to submit your application well in advance. You'll find that when there's specific deadlines, lots of people are trying to upload, and it can cause difficulties at the last minute, and it'd be really disappointing if you missed out on applying to a fund by 5 or 10 minutes. I'm now going to talk about fundraising for your project. Fundraising for your project isn't just about the money. It really is an opportunity to engage with your community, bring them along for the journey, give them this opportunity to get involved and contribute to what you're doing. And keeping these streams of communication open allows you to as Tamara was saying, really ensure that what you are doing reflects the needs of the community. You're in that regular conversation with the community. It's really valuable as a marketing and promotional opportunity. So fundraising campaigns do help to raise the profile of your project. And a chance to show funders that you have community support. Showing that you have a significant chunk of funding that's come from the community is a really good way to show to funders that you have this, and that this is generally a significant part of many capital funding applications. So really something to prioritise. In terms of types of fundraising, we've identified a few here. So some examples are corporate donations. So for example, as part of a corporate social responsibility strategy, you may have volunteers or members of the community who work for organisations who are looking for charitable or community organisations to support, for example. Individual donations. So these could be online or in-person donations. They could be one-off, or they could be sort of regular on a monthly or annual basis. Events, lots of different ways that you can fundraise through events. Some examples of these are auctions, raffles, things like sit-down dinners, concerts or performances, or you may have a combination of these in one event. Crowdfunding, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about, and sponsored activities, so things like runs and skydives. And there'll definitely be more that you can think of, or even more that you've already done. And this list really is as long as your creativity. In terms of crowdfunding, when we talk about crowdfunding, we're essentially talking about raising money from people. And this generally happens online. And we've listed and linked a few crowdfunding platforms here. Aviva also match fund crowdfunding donations, so worth considering to make your donations spread even further. And there are two types of crowdfunding that are likely to be most suitable for your project. So donation-based. This is simply asking for donations, for example, via platforms like Just Giving. And generally there's a target and people can log on and see the progress against that target. And then reward-based, so generally selling a product or service. This could be a product or service that you have available now, but it could also be a pledge of a product or service that you will have available once the asset is open, for example, access to a specific activity. And we've just provided some fundraising tips here. So having a clear and exciting vision and making it fun. So something that people want to be a part of, something that people want to buy into. It's important not to guilt trip people and make it possible to give as little or as much as people are able. And I think when you consider that, you know, this isn't just about the money, this is about community buy-in and community engagement as well, that puts that into perspective. Keeping it legal. So the fundraising regulator is linked here and provides guidance, including a new code of fundraising practice that's been published and will be available from the 1st of November this year. Sounds self-explanatory, but ensure you don't spend more in running your fundraising than you raise. It's worth assessing what time and resources you will need to run your fundraising campaign against the money you think you will make. These events are often quite time-consuming. Think about how companies can support you, perhaps with in-kind support. So this could be things like building materials or DIY support. And make sure that you're thanking all of your donors and remembering to keep them informed about the project. I'm now going to pass over to Karen Dobson at Scotswood Natural Community Garden. And please do remember to put any questions for Karen in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar.
Hi everyone. Josie, could we jump to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'm Karen Dobson. I've worked at Scotswood Garden for 13 years, 11 of those as the CEO, and I've really loved watching our community grow together over the years. The garden began its life 30 years ago in 1995. We're an environmental community charity and we're based in the West End of Newcastle upon Tyne. So you can see here our original mission, which was written in 2000, is shown in black, so which was to inspire and promote learning about nature, the environment and sustainable living. The green section was added later in 2017. After evaluating much of our work, we realised that we were focusing more and more on well-being and people care, particularly around having a positive impact on people's health and well-being. And this was true across all of our groups. Next slide, please, Josie. So I'm going to give you a very brief overview of what we do. So we work with and support up to 4,000 people a year from our local community. Our neighbourhood is ranked in the highest 10% for multiple deprivation, and we have child poverty levels at almost double the national average. So we work with and support people of all ages, people with a range of needs, including people living with disabilities, refugees and asylum seekers, people with mental health difficulties, long-term unemployed, and many more of whom who come to us through referrals from other organisations, from their GP, or even word of mouth. So we do this through a wide range of free programmes, most of which are grant funded. Each programme includes nature-based sessions, including a volunteer training programme for adults, adult wellbeing activities such as gardening for dementia, elderberries, which is nature-based art sessions for older people. We have a big educational visits and forest schools programme for young people with a range of needs, including those unable to access mainstream education. We have 5 inclusive play and youth work groups. We run big community fun days and lots more. And the thing everyone has in common that comes to us is the need to be outdoors, the need to be immersed in nature, and the real need to be part of a community. Often people don't always know that when they first come, but that's what they discover. So on to the next slide, please, Josie. So I'm going to talk about our capital project and how we secured funding for it and how we've juggled and managed working with different funders. So as I've said, we're very lucky. We have a beautiful 2.5 acre garden that was established back in 1995. The garden is on the site of what was previously a school playing field. Our building is what used to be a small school caretaker's house. So that's the picture at the top there. The upstairs we just used as an open plan office. We had 8 desks. We have 20 staff hot desking those 8 desks. And the downstairs room we kept as one kind of big room, not that big, and a small kitchen for 2 people, and there was 2 toilets. Unfortunately for us, the building was no longer fit for purpose in several ways. It needed extensive refurbishment, but more importantly, we just could not fit everyone in anymore. The main downstairs room fitted, excuse me, a maximum of 12 people around a table. So I don't know, to give an example, we'd be trying to feed a group of, say, 20 or more volunteers, because we would cook every day, whilst we might have 30 school children trying to get to the toilets, and someone else cooking preserves in the kitchen, also running a course and so on. It very much was running in the end on the goodwill of staff and a lot of timetabling to try and share the space, but it really wasn't fit for purpose anymore. So alongside this, like many charities, we were also looking at ways to diversify our income, but almost every idea we came up with required a suitable indoor space, which we just didn't have. So we realised we needed the space. So like Tamara said earlier, we initially reviewed options that didn't mean extending the building, such as adding more covered structures into the garden. We also looked at whether there were any local buildings that were empty and so on. But in the end, the best option was to extend. So we had a concrete backyard that we could extend into without impacting on the main garden or damaging any of the existing habitats. As you can see in the bottom picture, this is after we'd cleared everything from the backyard prior to the building work starting. So we had raised beds and picnic benches and things there previously. So when we decided we wanted to build, the first thing we did was approach Newcastle University's School of Architecture for support. So they applied for £10,000 of university funding to carry out a one-year community consultation on our behalf, and that happened in 2018. So they used participatory methods to find out what our existing staff and users wanted from the extension, as well as the needs of people from the local community. And the report they produced was incredibly useful and detailed. It was the foundation of the architect's design, and it was incredibly good evidence of community consultation when applying for funding. Many funders commented on how useful it was. So when looking for an architect, we researched builds in the Northeast. We visited other project builds that had a similar ethos to us for advice. We wanted a sustainable build that would have as minimal an environmental impact as possible and would provide us with a building that would future-proof the charity. So we did get some really good advice from the places we visited, but to be honest, the main advice we got was don't do it because it will take over your life, which is true. One particular project that we visited was Hawksley Nature Reserve, which was a really good match for us in terms of their eco-credentials and how the work was carried out. So we actually approached the same architect and project manager, and it turned out he had actually been one of the founding trustees of Scotswood Garden, so it really was a perfect match. He completely understood our mission, he understood what we wanted to achieve. So the formal design that we went with incorporated the use of recycled materials, including the main structure was made from redundant shipping containers, most of which we sourced from a nearby site that we're planning to be destroyed. With things like we have surplus sheep's wool is being used for the insulation, most of the wood is reclaimed timber. And then as well as that, there was lots of plans around energy storage and saving features. So solar panels, air source heat pump, the building will have a full living roof, water storage and how we would reuse that and so on. Could I get the next slide, please, Josie? Okay, so the next thing was to think about how we were going to get the funding for this work. So our initial approach to funding was kind of a lot of what Josie's already said. So we contacted our regular funders that knew us well to see if they were interested in helping us out. We spoke to our local CVS, the Community Foundation of Tyne and Wear, as well as doing capital searches on grant funder databases, finder databases to see what was available. We quickly realised that we were not going to be able to get all of the funding from one source. The initial estimate was just under £700,000 prior to the plans being fully drawn up and prior to the COVID pandemic. So our final spend will actually be 1.2 million. Much of this was due to the delays and cost rises after the pandemic. So we decided the best way to secure funding, as Josie suggested, was to split the build into phases with itemised sections within each phase. So we had 3 kind of core phases. The first one was a pre-construction phase, which we carried out prior to the pandemic. So this covered the costs of the architect's design, structural engineer consultancy, energy analysis, mechanical and electric design, quantity surveyors, building control fees, Great Crested Newt licensing, planning consent, listed building consent, and so on. And that pre-construction phase cost us £32,000. We got a fair amount of that from existing funders who were really keen for us to get the new building, but they couldn't necessarily afford to give us all of the money to do the build, but they were keen to help with those pre-construction costs that were difficult to get from anywhere else. So then our second phase, so we split the rest of the build kind of into two sections. So the second phase was all of the groundworks. This was all of the underground infrastructure, so like electrics, water, drainage, sewage, foundations, and so on. And we also included the costs of craning the shipping containers into place and then waterproofing them. The third and final phase is costing us around 850,000. This is the rest of the build, so the bit you'll actually see above ground, the walls, the roof insulation, etc. Obviously, this was the most expensive phase. So even within that, we had itemised sections. So for example, the kitchen fit out was listed as a cost of insulation, the cost of putting the living roof on, and so on. I will say at this point that the architect, who was also our building manager, really was not keen on the idea of phasing the build, because it was hard to have some natural cut-offs for different phases. But the funders loved it. It meant they had a really tangible part of the build that they could say they'd funded. So it also meant we were able to apply for every single bit of capital funding we saw, however small it was. So from the Rothley Trust, who gave us £1,600, which covered the cost of the air source heat pump, all the way to the Community Ownership Fund, who gave us just over £418,000 for the structural works. In total, we've had 18 different funders on the project. So funder requirements, I know Josie's touched on this, but I thought I would tell you the top 8 requests we had. So number 1 was match funding, particularly the larger funders. So obviously you need to get that initial grant to find that. So our first big grant was from the North East LEP. Once we had that, which more or less covered the whole of that second phase, the groundworks, it meant other grants were much easier to get in. Next, number 2 is community consultation. So that really important feasibility study that the university did for us. And it showed our service users were consulted and listened to. It showed that we'd considered alternatives to build the building and that there was a real need for the work. Number 3 is the obvious building plans and all of the associated positions. Number 4, Josie mentioned, is a business plan. A business plan that clearly shows the positive impact the new building will have. For us, this was being able to work with more people, improved accessibility, meaning we could diversify who we employed and who we worked with further, increased opportunities to generate training income, and an ambitious aim to have a net zero carbon building. And I would say this last thing, it was really key that it was the thing that most funders wanted to understand, the environmental impact of the build, both during it and afterwards. Number 5, a risk register for the charity. There's lots of templates on the NCVO you can look at. I'm happy to share ours if it's useful. Number 6, letters of support. So see who's in your local area. If you can get your local MP to write a letter. We had our ward councillors. Think about other local leaders, so head teachers. You've got religious organisations locally, so we had the imam from our local mosque, other local charities. Really important to get those letters of support. Number 7 is your charity accounts, and more importantly, 3 years cash flow forecasts. which would demonstrate after the build how our income may change, as well as how we were going to manage our income during the build to demonstrate we'd got the reserves to cover costs. Number 8, finally, is Josie mentioned policies, so things like procurement policy, environmental policy, and so on. Now, I know I said there was 8, but I'm actually going to add a 9 and a 10 that funders didn't actually ask us for, but were both things that really, really helped us to secure funding. So number 9 was a subcommittee, a building subcommittee. So that consists of trustees, staff, and a couple of volunteers. And funders really liked that we were still consulting throughout the process with that group. And then number 10, I think the thing that has been the best for us was we had 3D videos made, which were an artist impression of what the finished building would look like. So the funders absolutely loved these. It really brought the project alive alongside the before pictures of the building. So we had 4 videos, one from each side of the building, so kind of coming into the building and really demonstrating what was going to be produced. So I'm just looking at the slide. So I did add also a reminder to use your experts. For this, of course, we had Locality, but think about your experts you've already got. So we had secured a new trustee who was a civil engineer. He really understood the plans and could scrutinise them and ask the architect questions that I probably wouldn't have thought of. Our treasurer runs his own businesses, so he was really helpful in drawing up the business plan for the building and the cash flow forecasts. And then we also found a local law firm that agreed to do all of the legal work for us pro bono, and that has literally saved us thousands of pounds working with them. On to the next slide, please, Josie. So I've already mentioned that we split the building into phases. What this meant for us was that rather than waiting until we had all of the funding in place, we were able to start work as each phase was funded. So as we had really tangible stop points. So for the second phase, the groundworks, we tendered a specialist groundworks company to carry out the work, which you can see in this picture. It's hard to believe that there's £180,000 in the ground there. And this was just before the shipping containers were craned into place onto the concrete plinths. So this meant that while we were applying for funding for the rest of the work, we could tell funders that the work had started, all of the permissions were in place, and funders had something to come and see. Of course, it was a risk, because if we didn't secure the rest of the funding, we would have ended up with a half-finished site. But for us, it was a risk that we felt we could take based on the list of capital funders we'd sourced to apply to. It also meant some of the funders that had different end dates for their grants, because we'd already started building it, we were confident that we would be able to build within their timeframes. Obviously, in an ideal world, we'd have only had one funder for the whole process. Having more than one has definitely meant some clashing of requirements for us. A lot of this has mainly been clashing of legal requirements. So, for example, the lottery wanted a deed of dedication on our lease, and then the community ownership fund wanted a charge on our lease, which caused a bit of a clash. And then this also involved having to work with our landlord, which is Newcastle City Council, whose legal team are notoriously slow. So yeah, thank goodness for that pro bono legal support. It was really invaluable working through that and getting all of the different solicitors and lawyers talking to each other. So yeah, the legal requirements of funders has definitely caused the biggest delay. It was almost a year's delay getting the requirements between the lottery and the community ownership fund ironed out. And then that meant other funders were getting frustrated that we hadn't started work on that last phase. So as Josie said, just keeping in regular touch with them was essential to ensure they were well informed and they knew what was happening. None of the funders pulled their money as long as we kept them informed and said, you know, we are expecting to start building on this date. I think the other thing around juggling funders, that where we have match funding in place, some funders wanted us to continue to report it to them until all of the match funding was spent as well, not just their money. So for example, the North East LEP, who funded that second phase, we're still reporting to them until the build work's completed. Yeah, so you definitely need to have patience. Considering we began our feasibility work in 2018, we expect to complete on the 7th of November this year. I am told it's quite unusual because we have had lots of delays, the biggest of which was the COVID pandemic in the middle of it all. So prior to the pandemic, we'd got all of the funding secured. After the pandemic, the cost had pretty much doubled for that second phase. So we had to start fundraising again, which was pretty awful, I can't lie. Can we go to the next slide, please, Josie? So finally, what we wished we knew before we started, other than the very obvious that a pandemic was going to happen, which caused prices to skyrocket and massive delays because there was also a shortage of builders and materials. That definitely gave me some grey hairs. So I think things like time to produce applications. Josie mentioned that funders often want different things. So you've really got to plan in advance, particularly for the bigger plans, the bigger grants, like the community ownership fund, the second stage. Part of that application, I think, took us nearly 2 months with 2 members of staff working on it. Having never been part of a capital build before, I really didn't appreciate how many requirements there'd be up front before we even got to the point of building. And everything adds time to the process. So like the mining report took 5 months because they had to come back and do extra borehole drills and things. We needed a district level Great Crested Newt license. That took quite a lot of time and it was more cost because we had to get ecologists to come out to site. Listed building consent because we were within 10 metres of a grade 2 listed building. Yeah, the list goes on. I think I also wish we knew in advance all of the legal requirements from the larger funders. We didn't get told these until after we'd secured the grants. There were things that we definitely could have started sooner if we'd known funders required it. So just keep asking them what they're going to want. We had to have a valuation on our lease for one funder, which took 6 months, which meant they wouldn't sign the funding agreement or release the funding until that work was done. I think, as Josie said, just make sure you plan early for cash flow. Some of our biggest funders would release their grants in arrears. So you've got to have the cash flow in reserves so that you pay for it up front and then you claim the money back in arrears. I'm going to finish by saying I often get asked if we would have gone ahead with the build if we'd known it would take so long and so much work. And the short answer is yes, we definitely would, but ideally would have finished it before the pandemic for half the price. So this last slide just gives you the artist impression of what the end result will be that we're all really excited for. My contact information's there. There's also a YouTube link to where you can watch our 4 videos if you're interested. So thank you very much. I'll hand back to Josie.
Hi, I'm actually taking over now. I'm Debbie Lamb from Locality, and thanks very much, Karen. That was really brilliant. I'm going to talk about another couple of options outside of grant funding that you may want to consider. And the first of these is social investment. Now, bouncing a bit. Social investment is effectively loan finance, or it may be what's known as blended finance. So that's a mix of loan and grant. Generally, blended finance is around about 20% grant, 80% loan. Social investment's targeted at community and voluntary organisations. And what drives social investors is investment which delivers social benefit, but they also need to get their investment repaid. And there's information about social investors on My Community. You will need or should check out high street lenders as well. Many social investors will require you to be declined by a bank, but equally, if high street lenders will lend, they may offer cheaper loans. They're often not keen to lend to community and voluntary organisations because they don't necessarily understand the business models, and we have different forms of legal organisation. But if they're able to secure the loan against a building or another asset, more of that later, they may be willing to lend. So do check them out. As I say, social investors are investing for social benefits, and often those social benefits are a combination of social, economic and environmental. And your application for loan funding will need to suggest how they will be measured, because you'll be reporting on that throughout the term of the loan. Think about whether loan finance is right for your project. Firstly, check your governing document. Do you have the power to borrow? Some organisations don't, and you may need to change your memo notes. A really key thing is, does your project earn sufficient income to make the repayments? It isn't usually possible to use revenue grant funding to pay off a loan. So do think about this. I mean, if you are using, if you are buying a long-term building with effectively a mortgage, it may be possible, but you should be talking to your grant funders in advance before you go ahead. Will your ownership of the asset allow you to secure the loan against it? It may be easier to get loan funding, and it may be you may get cheaper loan funding if you can give security. If you have freehold or a long leasehold, quite often you can offer security, but the asset has to have a market value. It's not possible with many community asset transfer leases, because often they will have a clause in there which actually says that if the organisation ceases to operate, the asset goes back to the local authority. If you're looking for loan funding to refurbish a building, then you need to think about the length of lease. And a rule of thumb is going to be, is the length of your lease longer than the time you're going to take to repay the loan? So, making an application. You are going to need quite a lot of information. This is very similar to what you'd provide for a grant funder. You are going to need a 3-year cash flow forecast, which shows that you are expecting to be in a position to repay the loan. You can look at a cash flow forecast to work out how much you can borrow. You'll also need up-to-date management accounts, and a key part of this is showing what the current position of your financial position of your asset is and your organisation. You'll need a business plan, or the information that would go into a business plan, information about your legal structure, the members of your board, your business model, how you generate income, how you market. You'll need details of your social benefits and how they'll be measured. You may need other documentation. Lenders may want to see a valuation. If you're going to do a refurbishment, they may want to see quotes or a schedule from a QS. Usually there is an online application which would be followed up by meetings with an investment manager working for the social investor. Thought it might be useful just to outline the assessment process. The investment manager will work with you to work up all the information that's going to be needed so that it can go to an investment panel. Now, investment panels are usually made up of board members and other supporters from the social investor. And the investment panel looks in detail at the proposition. I did 9 years on the investment panel for Key Fund, who are loan funders in the North and the Midlands in England. And I can assure you that we did look at every proposition in quite a lot of detail. We're given quite a lot of information by the investment manager, including 3 years cash flow, and we did go through it. There was a lot of prep work went into it. The investment panel will consider any special conditions, such as repayment holiday on capital or interest. So, for example, if you're seeking loan funding as part of buying a building, then you may need a holiday on starting to pay back your loan while you actually go through the process of acquiring the building and start to actually do services and activities so that you can pay it back. So there may be a relatively short holiday which is allowed so that you can get the business up and running before you start having to repay. But the key questions that any investment panel is going to look at, and it's a really good idea to have it in the back of your mind, they will be thinking about whether there is a social benefit, but they will also be thinking about, will we get our money back? That's absolutely fundamental. Most social investors get investment from other people, and they are invested in by people like Big Society Capital because they're going to get money in and they're then going to reinvest it in other projects. So they do need to think about whether they'll get their money back. They will want to think about whether they can take security. They will want to think about who's involved in the organisation and whether they're able to manage it effectively. They'll want to know whether the board, the people who are managing the organisation, understand the risks. It is risky to own a building, to refurbish a building, to manage a building. And thinking about those risks, looking at how you can avoid them or how you can mitigate them is incredibly important. As Karen said, you need a risk register. Thought it was useful to talk a little bit about due diligence. Some grant funders will agree a grant in principle, and then there will be a lot of work done with you before you get to the stage of drawing down. And Karen talked about some of the issues that have come up for Scotswood Garden. Other loan funders basically will ask for all the information they want up front, and if they decide to invest in you, the money just turns up. With loan funding, that does not happen. You get an agreement that you can have a loan, but it's really, you do need to plan for the fact that there will be due diligence. Typically, things that they will ask you to do are, they will want a board minute agreeing that the organisation accepts the loan offer. So think about the timing of that in line so that you can do that quite quickly. The loan agreement will need to be signed. Quite often these days it's through DocuSign, but sometimes people want wet signatures. So that's another consideration. They will want identity checks on the board. That's in line with money laundering regulations. It doesn't mean that there are any additional expectations of the board. They're not being asked to guarantee the loan or anything like that, but they do need to be identity checked because of money laundering. Your investor may need sight of key documents. You may need to update your valuation. You may need to update your quotes. As Karen talked very movingly about, it can take a long time for asset projects to get to the stage where they're ready to go on site, even if you do phase it. And your documents may be out of date by the time you're ready to move forward. And I'm not going to talk more about taking a legal charge. Many many investors do want a legal charge, which if your organisation does cease to trade, cease to operate, that gives them the chance to get their money back from the sale of the asset. But it is complex, and as Karen talked about, if you've got more than one organisation which wants a legal charge, it can take ages. So at least 2 or 3 months if you've got a legal charge on it. But it does take time to complete the due diligence. Managing a loan. I mean, you're usually expected to set up a direct debit. Really important that if you think that you're not going to be able to make the payment 1 month or 2 months, or you've got a problem, talk to your investor as soon as possible. Social investors will try to be as helpful as they possibly can be. But they would far rather hear it directly from you than when your direct debit bounces. Remember, you've got regular monitoring requirements. Your obligations are to make repayments of capital and interest. You can't take out other borrowing or dispose of the asset without their permission. And do keep your investor up to date with changes in your organisation or your board. Loan funding can be reasonably straightforward. It's actually probably there's more loan funding available than perhaps for grant, but you have to be able to repay it. And that's, what most social investors are looking for are investable propositions. I'm going to talk briefly about community shares. Community shares allow individual investors to buy shares in your organisation, to raise money, to buy assets, to refurbish assets. Community shares are withdrawable, but they're not tradable. So an investor invests in your organisation, they can ask to have their money back, which would be repaid if you can afford to do it, but they can't be traded. So an individual who invests community shares in your organisation can't sell their shares to someone else or transfer them except in very limited cases. The shares attract interest. It's an equity investment. So it works rather like, in the same kind of way, there are significant differences. If somebody like Tesco puts out a share offer and you invest in it. One of the key differences is it is one investor, one vote. So if I invest £100 and Josie invests £20,000, I get one vote, Josie gets one vote. It isn't proportional to the shares. Your voting power isn't proportional to the size of the shares that you hold. And one of the things that we try to do within community shares is to make it really clear that investors could lose their investment. It's not something that's put in a footnote in, size 6 font. It's very much felt within community shares that you need to be really upfront about it. Community shares are often used to raise capital for the purchase or refurbishment of assets. A lot of use of it for community shops and pubs. A lot for renewable energy, solar, hydro, things like that. A lot for housing. But really, any asset which earns income could use community shares. Are community shares right for your project? Now, you need to have the right legal structure for community shares. You can't use community shares if you're a charitably incorporated organisation or a company limited by guarantee, because they're not forms of organisation which are based on shares. You could, in theory, raise community shares if you were a community interest company limited by shares, but you would be regulated in the same way as any limited company. So you'd the amount of regulation for companies limited by shares, for example, Tesco's, for communities would probably outweigh the amount that you would raise. So most people use a community benefit society. Now that came out of Industrial and Providence Society legislation set up in the 19th century. Many of you will have heard of the Rochdale Pioneers, who bought the first co-op shop, and in about 1829. And so it's very much in that long-term tradition of communities coming together to buy assets or to set up services for themselves. But it is complex legislation, and if you need to change your legal structure in order to use community shares, you need to take advice. The second one is back with the same thing with, as we talked about with loans. Will the project earn income? You need a clear proposition. What are the investors going to invest in? And you would set that out in a share offer document. You will usually need a business plan which is made public, and you will need detailed financial information, as Josie talked about, 3-year financial forecast, and that's shared with your investors. You'll need to give information about when interest will be paid and shares can be withdrawn. Most community share projects say that they will not pay interest for the first 3 years, and because this allows the business to get established and to build up the strength in the business so that they can pay interest. They will quite often say that shares can't be withdrawn for 5 years or more. This is back to the fact that community shares are an equity investment. So your investors are taking a risk on your business alongside the people who are involved in making it happen. If you take out a loan, you will say, I will pay this loan back in 5 years or 10 years, and you need to keep up the repayments. With community shares, if the organisation is not generating sufficient surplus, then you don't pay interest and you don't allow share withdrawals. So it can be a really helpful one for organisations where you're unsure about how much you expect to generate surpluses, but your surpluses may not be consistent. And it does mean that you haven't got pressing expectations that people have of repayments at a particular time. When you do a share offer, they're usually time limited, and you usually need to set a target for investment. People usually set a minimum, an optimum and a maximum. So potentially if we take the village shop, for example, you might say we need 250,000 in order to buy the shop. If we get to our optimum, which is 320,000, we'll be able to refit out the shop as well. If we get to our maximum, we'll also be able to add space for a cafe. So you're basically saying to your investors, we need a minimum, and generally, though, investors are repaid if you don't reach your minimum target. So you're saying, if we can get up to 250k, we can buy the shop. So it is thinking about what your targets would be. And community shares in general don't raise huge amounts of money. There are some notable examples which buck that trend, but usually, you're looking at local communities and being realistic, thinking about sort of 100,000, 200,000 up to about 400,000. So try and be realistic, and some of the support that you can get can help you to think through what is realistic in your case. Community share offers succeed because there is strong community engagement. And part of doing that initial community engagement can be really testing out with people, well, would you invest in it? Now, this is not at the stage where people are actually going to be signing on the line and saying, you know, I can contribute £100 or I can contribute £1,000. It's basically just asking people to give you an indication. Would you invest or not? If you would invest, how much are you likely to look at putting in? The strength of local support is what makes share offers succeed. And that is often why it's so important around things like village shops and village pubs. Because if they're the last facility in the village, people feel strongly and want to retain that facility. And you do need a clear proposition. People need to understand exactly what, you know, we contribute this and this is what happens if you reach your target. Many share offers use a community share platform as well. I mean, typical ones are Crowdfunder or Ethex. And that can attract investment from beyond the local area. Some of these crowdfunding platforms will have people who are interested in investing in community shares. Typically, they tend to have people who are interested in renewable energy. They may have people who are interested in housing. Reliable propositions backed by assets are the most popular on these kind of sites. Sometimes they have offers to match community investments. There was one recently around renewable energy. But they are genuinely no substitute for active community engagement. Just putting them onto a site and hoping it will raise community shares does not usually happen. You need to have an active programme for community engagement. And that's where we come to the Sharemark and the Booster programme. Now, the Booster programme is run by Co-ops UK, and there are two parts to it. There is grant funding to help people to prepare for and launch a share offer, and that grant funding can be up to £10,000. So preparing for a share offer might be getting your business plan into shape, starting to draft your share documents. It might be help with your legal structure. Launching a share offer is looking at perhaps, you know, putting into place a website, putting together marketing materials, holding events. The Booster programme can also make equity investments. That's usually a small percentage of the total expected raise, but it can be helpful. They will sometimes put in at an early stage in a share programme to show backing and to show confidence. They can't invest in every equity, every share offer, but one of the key things that you do need to have to qualify to go for that equity investment from the Booster programme is a Sharemark. Sharemark is a quality assessment of your share offer and your supporting documents. There are no regulations governing community share offers at the moment. And, you know, hopefully the government will see that share offers are generally well run and hopefully won't feel the need to bring in any form of regulation. Getting the Sharemark means that it gives reassurance to investors that people have been through and checked everything that is being put forward. And I can assure you that it is an incredibly intensive assessment. I just did my first a couple of months ago because I'm training to be a Sharemark assessor, and literally go through everything line by line and provide feedback. If you are going to do, if you sign up to the Sharemark, you also sign up to a code of conduct, which is really about keeping your investors informed and making sure that there's good communications and that you are keeping people up to date. Shares can be a way of bringing in new capital that wouldn't be available in, you know, through loans, through grants. It is an option to think about as you go through putting together your fundraising plans. And my final section, which is going to be very short, is about record keeping for an informed board and informed funders and investors. Thinking first about board information. Your board and management committee should, in line with good practice, approve your funding strategy and approve each major funding application. And by this, I don't mean 200 quid for, you know, a play session or a lunch club, but major funding applications which are related to buying or refurbishing buildings, they should understand and they should agree to accept each offer of funding. Putting together some paperwork is really useful. Summarising the terms and conditions of each of your investments, your grants, loans, community shares, on half a side of A4 can be incredibly useful because your board can have copies, your management team can have copies, and it reminds you what the terms and conditions are. We've talked about this being a long-term process. It's quite likely that the asset is going to be there long after the staff and the current trustees have moved on. And there may still be terms and conditions related to the investment that they need to be continuing to think about. So there may be restrictions for many, many years on whether you can sell the building, whether you can borrow against it, and so on. And you need to make sure you don't forget about those. If there are any conditions to the investment, make an action plan and make sure you do them. There may be things which are send us photographs as soon as you've finished refurbishing the building. It may be send us a copy of the title once you've bought the building. But it could be something more general. Grant funders may say, well, we'll lend to you, but we're a little bit concerned about the fact that you've got too few board members, or we're a little bit worried that your board members may be a little weak on finance or something like that. So they may be suggesting recruiting more board members or some board training or something like that. Make sure that you've got an action plan, you do the work, and you report back to them on it. It's good practice to have an annual review of the main sources of funding. As I say, there may be terms that you have to comply with for a long time, and going back and checking through, make sure that you're not missing anything and that any decisions you're making are based on a solid foundation. No pun intended. And your funders and investors may sound obvious, but read the drawdown requirements, read the terms and conditions. Not the greatest fun bit of reading you're ever going to do, but absolutely important. Comply with the reporting requirements. Check if there are procurement requirements. Can you do it by getting 3 quotes? Do you need to do a full tender? Make sure you understand, because funders will expect you to have complied with their requirements. Remember that you may need position to sell the asset further down the line, to take out further borrowing. Remember if there is a legal charge, when that will be satisfied and when it can be removed. There may be big guidelines around acknowledging the investment. Some grant funders will send you reams of publicity requirements which you have to comply with. And finally, keep in touch. Send funders and investors regular reports, even if they're not a requirement. It's an opportunity to build a relationship. They are supporters. They have given you money. They may help you in the future. So do use this as an opportunity to build a relationship. Just a reminder, there are resources and useful templates on my community. Do check it out after this session. Really like to thank Karen in particular for telling us about her experiences, but thank you to Tamara and Josie and to Rachel for doing the backup on the tech. Just to confirm that we will be sending around the slides. We'll also be sending around a recording of this webinar, and a recording of this webinar will go onto my community in due course. So if there are bits of, I think a lot of people have been talking about bits of Karen's presentation and her 10 points and things that they really want, that they would like to be able to go back to, you will be able to. We'd like to thank you all for coming, and there will be further webinars around this, particularly around managing assets. So please do keep an eye out, and thank you all.